another production of CATA TechNOW television. I'm very pleased to have joining us today a special guest, Valarie Findlay. Valarie has been a CATA member for a couple of years now, and we're engaged in a number of different studies with her in the cybersecurity area. And she's been very kind to join us today from her home office, which I greatly appreciate. I know you're very busy, Val, so why don't you say hello and introduce yourself and tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. So yeah, my name is Valarie Findlay. I'm a cybersecurity analyst and specialist. I'm a native of Ottawa, so I have worked for federal government for about 15 years, and in the areas of infrastructure security and in cybersecurity, of course. So my background in terms of my education is I have a certificate in terrorism studies, and I'm currently working on my dissertation for terrorism studies as well. And my thesis is on militarization law enforcement. But I have specialized in cybersecurity, and as you've said, Kevin, produced a number of studies in that area. My main areas of concern now are in terms of where the new technology is making a convergence with our generalized behaviors on the internet, and of course our countermeasures that we're using in government specifically.
Well, and that's you know, when we're talking about cybersecurity and cybercrime, we were really pleased to have you be able to present our recent cybersecurity forum on cyber terrorism. Before we engage in the study, because I know the study does root itself a little bit on the counter-terror model, do you want to define for us your perspective on cyber terrorism? I know a lot's been going on in the media. We've been discussing it recently and how it might be that concept's being misrepresented. So would you mind enlightening us a little bit on what cyber terrorism really means?
Sure. My assistant might help as well. It's funny, I have this discussion quite often with people because when we hear the term cyber terrorism, there's an inference with that word and of course a visceral feeling towards it, where we're talking about something very specific, and really in the history of cyber threat we haven't really seen that happen yet. So when we talk about terrorism, and if we just tack it on to the word cyber, we're looking at an event that really produces an event that changes people's behaviors but is rooted in terror. And terror is a very, very strong word. And typically we're looking for threats that either it's a threat of violence or the actual act of violence against typically non-combatants. So yes, that's the general public, and when we talk about, you know, Sony and the Sony hacks, I think there's been a lot of, you know, references to cyber terror because there were actually threats involved. But, you know, the measure in using that term is, was there a threat of you know, deep violence, and did it absolutely terrorize people? And why that's important is because when we start talking about legislation and interdiction, it's really important to differentiate between terrorism, acts of terrorism, and actual computer crime or cyber crime. So what I like to normally underscore, because really the importance of what we do professionally, and we want to move away from looking at risks and really focusing on the threats and providing a good blanket of analysis over top of that. We have a lot of mechanisms for doing that, especially in federal government. We have standards related to threat risk assessments. A number of these things have been around for a long time. They are tactical, but terrorism itself is tactical. What I'm trying to do with the study is to really examine the strategic layer and then how we address prescriptively these tactical measures, where we're looking at safeguards and countermeasures and how we're protecting our valued assets. And also really identifying those assets. The value of the asset as we perceive it may be completely different to a malicious actor, and it's really important to have a really clear, concise analysis of your threats, your risks, your assets, your vulnerabilities, and to also look beyond the cost, because I think we've always focused on really the cost of having exploits, especially with our TRA model, and looking at the degree of harm. And I think that's a more productive way of assessing it. And in that whole model, being able to take a strategic approach and really, boil this into a really firm model for how do we respond to cyber threat.
So what would be the end result of this study? We're calling it communicating the threat, and at the broadest level, we're looking at trying to better understand what levels of communication are or are not taking place between key public safety stakeholders as a part of it, and of course arriving at the model itself. What would an organization gain from this model? How, in a practical sense, will it be applied, or could it be applied?
I think there's three specific areas that are outlined in the prospectus and that were delineated from the preliminary study, which is where all of this came from. This wasn't purely an empirical notion. There was a fair amount of work done prior to really test the thoughts and theories and come up with a good, solid hypothesis. So I think we're looking at, the three areas. One, how we share information. Is it adequate, and are we moving away from our vertical streams of housing information within federal departments and private sector and industry to a truly lateral communication of this information as we're gaining intelligence and as events are unfolding or as vulnerabilities or threats are known, and how we're actually utilizing that intel, and are we putting the information out there, and are we, responding to it effectively, and are we also revoking? So are we, if we use something specific like blacklisting, if we blacklist a particular DNS, are we going back at some point and actually taking a look and seeing if that's still valid? And I think that ties into, to some degree, the concept around looking at a new threat risk assessment tool or approach. And that really is around how we do the analysis in a typical TRA model that we've always used. Is it still working? Are we doing it often enough and under the right circumstances? So I think frequently we have devices, we do a TRA, we put it into production, and we don't touch it again until we have a problem. And I think in order for us to keep up with the emerging technologies, and there are a lot, there's so much on the horizon that really has not become part of our day-to-day language, it's really important that we stay ahead of the curve. What we have to remember is the bad guys, this is their full-time job, and they live and breathe it. They're paid very well for it in a variety of means, and we have to have resources that do the same thing. The other area is looking at cyber threats and how they fit in the counter-terror model. So we have a counter-terror model that is, basically it's legislation, it's the criminal code. It's federal policing, provincial policing, community policing. We have a number of federal departments, CIC, Transport, CBSA, that contribute information. And the crux of that model is to share information, capabilities, and skills. So we need to look at doing the same thing with cyber threat, because for new approaches where it's required.
And just before our call, not that you're not busy enough, you talked about another 2 articles that you're looking to author and engage in some further exploration. Do you want to just take a quick moment to describe what those 2 articles will pertain to?
Sure. There are actually 2 areas that I have a really, really strong interest in, and one is specifically around Web 3.0. So Web 3.0 is a concept, right? So internet doesn't really have versions, but we have a terminology of, Web 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0, and there is actually a 4.0 that describes the functionality and the behavior of the internet with us as human beings. So Web 3.0 is really the semantic web. We're seeing that a little bit now with the technologies. The more the technologies are being developed, especially around natural language and around cognitive computing and machine learning, we're going to see computers presenting things to us based on, and it sounds like we are doing it now, but it's amazing how it's going to change. So based on our current behaviors and actions, cumulative knowledge, so this is tying into big data, into metadata, and bringing all this data together from what we know the web to be now, which is really a bunch of linked documents, to linked data. So we're going down to the data level, we're putting context into the data, and then we're drawing relationships. As we've done this with particular technologies, computers will start doing this and developing the algorithms on their own. So there's a huge impact there in terms of how we use the computers for our business and personal life. So security and privacy are impacted. To what extent is what the article is going to talk about. And this article is going to be different because it's going to actually describe scenarios that are probable and possible without prophesizing, to give examples of where these capabilities might impact us. And that can be very difficult for people to get their heads around. So in order to bring this to the forefront and describe the importance of it, that's the approach I used. The other article is on the Sony hack and what the Sony hack means in technical terms, why that's important to us, because I think we look at that as the target was Sony, is it really that big of a deal sold on their systems? But there's a number of aspects of that whole piece of the incident that are really important. One being is that the malware, the exploit, went on for a year before anyone noticed. That's a very dangerous concept. So that's something I'm also going to treat in the same way and draw some, really solid scenarios and really tease out the technical aspects of that to help people understand a bit, especially the people in our security operations centers and our federal government people who are making decisions around security, why these things are really important and why we understand them so that we can apply the proper countermeasures.
Wow. It sounds like you're going to be busy with us for the next year.
Oh, I'm going to whip it out in no time.
So for our viewers, for those who are interested in the study, obviously we're seeking supporters who can financially help us get off the ground. But in terms of those people that we're hoping will be an active part of the study as either a interviewee or perhaps as in an advisory capacity, what would your request be of listeners of this video in terms of, after this conversation, how should they engage with you, and who would be, in your opinion, the ideal people to be reaching out to us?
I think the ideal people, we want to involve government, academia, private sector, and industry. I think it's really important that we are talking to all three, academia being in terms of a supportive role, what needs to happen for the communication to flow, and what are the barriers, what that stop us from sharing information either with other departments or with private sector or talking to industry and academia. I know there's always there certainly is a hesitation with academia to involve them because there's definitely a lexicon issue. It can be very difficult to apply academic notions into the operationalized environments that we work in. So, how do we normalize that, and how do we get a good dialogue? Because that's the success around instituting, proper countermeasures with respect to cyber threats, is having everybody on the same page. Because what's important to note around all of this is that our networks, this is not, we can't think of the web the way we used to in the mid-90s. All our networks, we're all interconnected. And there's a number of exploits that utilize networks as channels to their targets. That's a huge issue. So if other areas are not securitized properly, they're as much of a risk as the target itself. So, having people that are able to lend knowledge in that area as either interviewees, peer reviewers, so technical people that we can talk to who want to lend their expertise is certainly welcome, because we want that breadth of knowledge. Also, resources who are in a decision-making capacity where, and I think it's going to be compelling enough that they're going to understand the importance of this study and that this is something very different, very new. We're looking at changing the landscape, and hopefully to the extent where it impacts legislation years from now, and that they would want to be involved in this and essentially pilot this in their own departments or their own organizations and effectively become leaders to spearhead this.
Perfect. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, Val, and I'm certainly hoping and anticipating that we'll have you on a few more times as we roll out these studies and different engagements with our partners and those that we're seeking to help take part. So thank you very much for joining us today and providing us this broader overview. I promise we will have you back and your lovely assistant, and, and we'll certainly be asking anyone who's watching this video today, please get a hold of either myself or Val. In post-production, I'll add our contact information following this, and look forward to speaking with you all in the very near future. Thanks again, Val, and thank you all for joining us today. Look forward to the next conversation.
Thanks, Kevin.